The villagers have organised this ceremony to ask the forest spirits to bless the forthcoming KFCP activities, which is a large-scale blocking of canals to rehabilitate the peatlands. So by blocking off the man-made canals, it should re-wet the peat, and that will hopefully reduce the potential for fires and allow the vegetation to grow again. It's really important that projects, RED Plus projects, especially though because development is such a large part of RED Plus, that we respect local customs and traditions. So usually in areas where there's a very strong set of customary traditions, such as the villages in the KFCP area, that the Dayak hold a large ceremony before undertaking any activities so as not to disturb the spirits in the forest. The really distinctive thing about KFCP is that we're as much about capacity building as we are about undertaking RED Plus interventions and development interventions. So we work with the villagers, we build up their skills, and to some extent we let them guide us on the appropriate times to undertake activities, where are appropriate places. They organise many of the activities. So there's activity implementation teams in KFCP, but they're made up of villagers. They're not KFCP staff, but we spend a lot of time working with them to build up their skills to be able to manage projects which they haven't necessarily done before. So there's a lot of learning that goes on in KFCP, and because we let them guide us with the appropriate ways to implement activities, following local custom and tradition is a key aspect of that. In my experience, KFCP is very much representative of many of the other development interventions and projects I've worked on. You're operating in a social context, so there's quite extensive social dynamics. I remember once working with a local researcher who was actually a local priest, and he gave me one piece of very good advice, which was, Rachael, villages and social life there is very, very complicated. So KFCP has its own social dynamics, and we try to operate as neutrally as possible. But in some instances, because of local politics, people with different interests can try and attempt to involve the project in that, and the important thing is thinking about how to manage that, making sure you're very aware of that, not to play into it as much as possible. Things like RED Plus are about change, and change is going to have a large swathe of supporters and sometimes a level of opposition, and it's about finding the middle ground. But it's absolutely inevitable, as anybody working in development around the world would know. I think local communities understand. They may not be able to articulate things in the complex language of RED Plus using the appropriate terms which are thrown around in the international discourse. So I think anybody trying to investigate those kinds of issues and concepts and levels of community understanding, especially in remote areas, really need to think about how they ask questions and how they try and capture community understanding, because with new people coming in using complex concepts and language and technical terms that villagers haven't heard before, tend to walk away and think, oh well, maybe they don't understand RED Plus. Whereas actually, if you had have sat down and engaged and listened to the way that local people describe things themselves, you'd be more likely to capture this deep understanding of what's going on. They know that the dry heat can easily ignite into fires that are very difficult to put out, very, very difficult to put out. They know, changing water levels can affect their rice fields. They know that, potentially re-wetting the peat's going to have long-standing benefits for both the local environment and the community. So I think over time, KFCP is very much about learning while also trying to improve welfare and rehabilitate the peat lands. I think, slowly communities to varied levels are starting to understand the link between their local environment and the global environment and the reduction of emissions. And that's one of the things that I've noticed is coming through today in this ceremony. Many of the Adat leaders were making those links between their efforts here and the learning they're undertaking as an example for the world to follow from. I think it's fantastic. I love watching people really engage with the whole process. We've had people voluntarily come down from Kapuas to participate, from the local government, from the local customary society. For me personally, it's wonderful to be able to be here because it's a real challenge given the debates around RED to forge forward. And it reminds you of how important it is to people on the ground, and I think that gives people, myself, the motivation to keep going in terms of working towards the better good for Kalimantan, for Kapuas, for the KFCP villages, for Indonesia more generally, and hopefully over the long term for improving the negative effects of emissions.